It says we're unable to start because the host has stopped it. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. We're good.
We're good.
Yes.
Hello.
It's not. I have the YouTube here right beside me, and it's not showing.
Mm. It's delayed. It's probably a little bit delayed.
It is delayed. It is delayed. Okay, now it's going to start.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're in. Good evening, everyone. Before we start, we began by acknowledging that while we are virtually hosting this event, the moderators are beaming this panel from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Teleswatsu First Nation. And with this land acknowledgement, we affirm that decolonization and reconciliation includes, but is not limited to, return of stolen land, restitution, reparations, and justice for past and ongoing colonial subjugation. Welcome to this second dialogue of the series, Struggles in Places, Contagious Traditions of Resistance and Solidarity, kindly sponsored by the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The series is organized by doctoral students Alejandra Gaviria, David Eng, Mai Jensen, and me. My name is Fabiola Bazo. I will be your host. I'm a doctoral student at the Social Justice Institute, and I write about the politics of gender in Peruvian rock music. Today, we have invited two distinguished subteólogos, mis compañeros in battles against machismo and Peruvian punk chauvinism. We have Olga Rodriguez-Ulloa. She's a professor of contemporary Latin American culture and literature, specialized in the Andean region at Lafayette College. Her current project, Sadistic Cholas, Violence and Sex in Contemporary Peruvian Culture, explores literary, visual, and media representations of multiple racialized sexualities since the 1980s. Shane Greene is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Indiana University and the author of Punk and Revolution, 7 More Interpretations of Peruvian Reality, and Customizing and the Indigeneity, Path to a Visionary Politics in Peru. Shane's research about Latin America covers a variety of topics: social movements, race, and multicultural politics, music, arts, and urban subculture. He is also an occasional musician, and a pretty good one, and currently plays in a band called El Cuervo Sucio. Welcome, Olga and Shane, to this virtual session. I will throw at you some questions to start the dialogue. The audience can also intervene and submit their questions while we are talking. So there is no need to wait until the end. You, audience, if you feel like asking something, just send it to us. David, Mai, and Alejandra will be monitoring the interventions from the audience. And this is a conversation among friends, so don't be shy. So first of all, can punk lenses really be useful in thinking about injustice in the global at this historical moment?
So thank you, Fabiola, for inviting us, and thank you to all your colleagues at UBC. We've decided to kind of go back and forth, and like I'll start some of the answers and Shane will follow. So we were thinking about the important question that you proposed here. Punk lenses, can they be a tool to fight injustice in the global present? And I think that for me depends how do you define these punk lenses, right? Because there is no one punk lenses available for all struggles, let's say. And what we put forward in the book is that at various moments in times, punk lenses or certain punk lenses, when situated in particular scenarios and to particular groups, were insufficient to address other issues about social injustice. So one of the first things to say would be like the book takes on or thinks about punk lenses as very wide and very multiple in spaces and in time too.
Yeah, I mean, sort of inherently heterogeneous, I guess. I mean, that's the word heterogeneity is something we kind of pick up on in the introduction and sort of use. It has its own kind of interesting, complicated kind of trajectory in Latin American thought. Aníbal Quijano, Cornejo Polar, and they're referencing Mariátegui and a series of other thinkers, and we're sort of using that as a way to sort of start a conversation about what it would mean to kind of open up a conversation around sort of radically heterogeneous punk rather than the kind of canonized version that we're often kind of recycling, or it's being recycled to us, I guess, in various ways. And so, I mean, I don't know, I guess my other thing, thinking about, to give an example, something that's actually in the book, the difference, because when you pose a question like sort of, can punk be useful for sort of thinking about injustice? Obviously it can be useful for thinking about it. I guess the real question is, can it be useful for doing anything about it? Those are two different things, right? All of the people in the book are thinking about it in various kinds of ways. Doing something about it is kind of a slightly different matter. For me, I mean, I feel like you can ask too much of punk and also expect too little, right? Like there's sort of a danger going either way. And I mean, for me, a lot of times the question of sort of the more provocative moments in punk stand out for me as moments where sort of particular punk episodes of like really kind of public provocation that actually garnered a response are oftentimes good to think about. So that maybe a canonical version would be the Sex Pistols and sort of Bill Grundy in '76. A more recent version would be like Pussy Riot. But like one of the things that we look at in the book is I don't know if you guys know Porno para Ricardo. This is a Cuban punk band from sort of the 2000s, more or less up to the present. And in a radically different context, at a radically different scale, because they're precisely not getting mass media attention. This is a band that's, sort of, now part of a second, third, fourth generation of Cubans who are younger Cubans who are quite discontent with the kind of residue of the socialist state, right? And its kind of inability to kind of really transform in the sort of face of various kinds of demands for reform, right? And anyway, there's this really interesting kind of moment in, I think it's 2010 or 2011, when the band organizes a spontaneous kind of like guerrilla style concert on the balcony of the guitarist and singer's apartment, and is immediately shut down by sort of state officials. So just, sort of punk as a mode of provocation rather than like having a concrete proposal. Like it's not an NGO, it's not in and of itself like an activist network, right? But it does engage in these kinds of sort of moments of provocation that sometimes actually produce a response, right? And I think in those moments where you kind of get a sense that there's potentially something there, to be as potential at least, right? As potential to sort of scream, as it were, and kind of shake people out of their complacency in certain moments.
Right. So the punk then still moves since the 70s within the aesthetic field. So these are aesthetical provocations that not necessarily have become activism, political activism. And that's what you have seen also in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in other words, I don't think you want to conflate absolutely. Someone might be a punk and an activist. They might even think of themselves as a punk activist, but I don't think punk and activism are the same thing, if that makes sense, right? I mean, and at least insofar as like punk being sort of heavily devoted to the production of certain kinds of cultural expression, right? Music, art, fanzines, obviously those kinds of things. all of which are in a more kind of overtly aesthetic expressive mode. And the question is, well, you know, do those particular individuals in any given scene translate that into other forms of action, right? Outside the club, outside the scene, you know, in other spaces, and at times they have.
I mean, we've also compiled in the book moments or like chronicles of feminist women. I mean, women that do fanzine in Colombia, and they are doing activism too, because they are constantly gathering and producing together. We also have a festival in Sao Paulo called Verdurada. So we have like these moments where there is this provocation that Shane's mentioned, but there is also a more like grassroots organization of punks in Latin America. And we've also were focusing on women too, as we're probably going to tell you more examples of those later on.
So now these interventions, do they reimagine humanity? Do they offer you a different way, or is they are still focused on the anger and saying the system doesn't work?
Good question.
I mean, they still focused on sort of this like liberation through violence and anger. But again, like we don't think, or at least I don't think, that punk's aesthetics is like one thing. Like, I don't think we can, you know, subsume punk's aesthetics only in anger. So the book has multiple examples of different kinds of aesthetics, right? And like aesthetics on itself, like the way we're seeing it with punk, is not necessarily like aesthetics intervenes in like a material world, you know, like it doesn't change, or there are moments that there is a certain palpable change in affect or like in a space, right? But certainly it's like way of changing material realities is more through production and ways in which punks can collaborate than other than, you know, like a big sort of revolution. So yeah, that's what we looked at in the book, like these moments of like small interventions, and aesthetics can help in doing that. But ultimately it's a matter of how do punks decide or agree to do certain things, what's more important. Are people really having a consensus? Are people, you know, like maintaining certain hierarchies, like it happened in the Peruvian case, for example? Or are they trying to be radically, you know, horizontal or different?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, I don't know, maybe one way to think about it is insofar as it promises, quote unquote, a revolution, it's like the kind of ongoing revolution of everyday life rather than radical overthrow and rupture. Which is to say, I mean, I know you wanted to talk about DIY later, but like, just, you know, I mean, it's a liberating, like sort of unalienating feeling to like just realize you can go out and produce your own album or produce your own fanzine, and suddenly discover there's other people doing the same thing, and then produce it together. We can talk about the production of the book itself if you want to. It contained that kind of dynamic in various ways, even though we do have an official publisher. The personalities that are in it, the process through which it kind of got carried out is still kind of reflective of this kind of attempt to create more of a kind of horizontal relationship across radically different kinds of personalities and really different positions and backgrounds. I guess the other thing I would say about, sort of the relationship of punk in the future, which, as you know, like it or not, since the 70s, it's had this, for better or worse, kind of no future label produced out of it and cast upon it and back and forth. And I mean, I think one of the other things that we're trying to do, or at least that's my perception of it in the book, is not kind of place punk in an uncomfortable position of being the solution for everything. It's as much negative as it is positive. It's as much an object of critique as it is a potential kind of platform for, different kinds of affect, or producing a kind of rallying cry for a local scene, or a different kind of aesthetic for you to kind of unalienate yourself, however briefly. I mean, yes, it's as optimistic as it is pessimistic in different moments, right? It's as nihilistic in certain moments as it is like radically kind of positive and hopeful in others. And you can see this in some of the contributions, like thinking of, a lot, but like Meredith Vieira's piece about sort of punk feminism, sort of attempts to really produce a sort of collective space around punk feminism in Mexico City. She writes about really kind of contemporary stuff and her own involvement in it as a kind of instigator and activist in this particular scene. She's very hopeful. Her piece comes across as very hopeful. And then I'm thinking of like kind of almost at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have some poetry and essays by this guy, Giovanni Oquendo, he was a gay punk from Medellin in the 1980s and 1990s. He's dead. He died of HIV-related problem.
Breaking a little bit, Shane.
Sorry. So the sort of, almost exact counterpoint is this guy, Giovanni Oquendo, who was a gay punk from Medellin during literally the kind of rise of Escobar in the 80s and early 90s. And through a series of contacts that we have in Colombia, we decided to basically translate and sort of republish some of his poetry posthumously. He's been dead since 2006. And his perspective through poems and through short essays and the stuff we have in the book and in general is just devastatingly nihilistic, like radically unhopeful. And, it was in part, obviously, the product of the moment, the environment that he was in. But I think, we don't want to deny that like punk can be a space of radical hope for the future and like radical despair at the same time, and probably everything in between. So it's kind of got those two polarities throughout in different ways, for sure.
Understood. We have been talking about the book, but we haven't said the title of the book.
True. It's called Punk Las Américas edition. And we're using the Spanish purposely, but it's actually hemispheric. Like there's stuff about the US, not canonical places in the US, like the places that get covered are more like Raleigh, North Carolina, and Missouri, Alaska. They're not, they ain't fucking New York and LA. There's an interview with Alice Bagg, so LA's, and Amina Cruz, who has like a visual essay, a photo essay, has photos from LA, but like we also sort of wanted to think about which parts of the US we were kind of touching on, so not to kind of just continue reproducing the same kind of lower Manhattan pantheon kind of problem.
Of course it has Peruvian
Why
punk.
did you decide to go for Americas? Yeah.
Well, the idea is that there is not like the way we think about it here in the US is America is the US, right? And America is the whole hemisphere. And also to think about how the role of the US have played historically in Latin America, and how Latin America has been seen as the backyard of the US, a place to be, controlled by imperialism, but also constant military interventions and the drug and war and, the free trade deals that go on and definitely are unbeneficial for that, all those other Americas. So the idea was to think again, about heterogeneity, but also about all those legacies of confrontation and conflict between the US and Latin America, right? I mean, we can think of places that have maintained a very kind of like amicable relationship with the US, and we can locate there Peru, for example, and we can think about places like Cuba with our example for Porno para Ricardo, who have been more contentious, and we can think about places like Puerto Rico, whose relationship with the US is still extremely difficult and colonial and imperial. And Judy Rodriguez has a piece about that whole problematic there, and how anti-Blackness is something that comes off Puerto Rican punk and connects the US and Puerto Rico as one land, but one land that is always contentious, that is always fighting against each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is the other kind of thing that we wanted to do with a kind of broad Americas frame or hemispheric frame was to kind of just flagrantly say there's nothing exceptional about the US. The only thing that's exceptional about it is like how incredibly imperialistic it has acted for like 150 to 180 years in different scales, in different ways, you know, all the kinds of things that Olga was pointing to. And even that is like increasingly in question, right? With the rise of China and Russia and so on. Like we just wanted to be basically like, it's just another fucking country at some level, right? And it's certainly not in the ways that it's been talked about as somehow exceptionally democratic with shining cities and the promise of the future is always somehow here. Guess what? No.
If
no.
anything, it's exceptionally fucked up country for a lot of Latin Americans, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's only being proven like in more and more clearer terms, like every single day, right? As we move through what is now our present, right? Which looks like a distinct lack of a future at the moment. So anyway.
Now I would like to move the conversation to Bolivia.
Okay.
Because we have been talking about the Chixi Punks. So for the audience, so Chixi in Aymara means something that is and is not. It's a notion that expresses the parallel coexistence of multiple cultural differences that do not distinguish nor aspire to fuse, but instead antagonize with each other, antagonize and complement each other. So it was something that was really, it sounds very punk, right? So, but I would like to know, why did you choose to connect it with punk? Where did that come from? Because I find it very, I think, yes, Chixi Punk is going to stay.
It was her idea. It was her idea.
I mean, it came from also talking to Shane and Rodrigo and meeting in Lima multiple times, and also in Mexico City, and like just trying to think about a theoretical framework for the book, or particularly for the introduction that was not necessarily focused on the North too. So we decided to go in the introduction with Segato, and the author of the Chixi is Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, right? This sociologist, Bolivian sociologist. So she, the idea was, well, she's profoundly punk. The way that
that's what we think.
Yeah, that's what I think. When I met her, I thought this woman is extremely, radical, and like she has been doing all kinds of amazing work with like oral history in Bolivia, meeting with the workers consistently throughout her life. She has this radical kind of intake in about thinking that theory should be one with practice. And the way she uses the Chixi is kind of like put it against or antagonize the Cheche with synthesis and something that needs to be resolved, right? So, and Cheche is something that has a stain, alguien manchado, or like a piece of rock that is black and white that looks like it's gray, but it's actually not. So it's an optical and a relational concept. So it matters only where you're situated with this Cheche object or subject. And Cheche subjects are also urban people, urban indigenous people in Bolivia, like how for a white audience or for a typical academic, there's always this necessity or like this need to see indigenous people as some people that are like aside from time and space, and like kind of like solving this contradiction and asking for authenticity. Where in her work, like we can be a big contradiction. And I think that what I've been trying to think the most in those terms is like, what kind of contradictions are we going to accept, right? Because it's not just a matter of contradictions, but for me in my work and in my reading of Silvia's work is there should be an importance. She doesn't elaborate on Cheche a lot. She kind of just provokes with this concept. And in my work, I think what is going to become important is to see what kind of contradictions are, valid or productive, or like depending on who's talking or what kind of agenda, political agenda is putting forward.
I mean, I had knew of her work and had read a little bit, but not nearly as much. And it was basically Olga's idea. So sort of Rodrigo and I, in writing the introduction, just kind of, we did a round robin, and that was a big chunk of Olga's stuff was that, and sort of that made me at least go kind of look more into it. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, in addition to what she's saying, I really like the idea of like not presenting it as something that resolves, like the way a dialectical kind of process eventually promises you the final wonderful utopian moment. Like, fuck that. Like we're never going to have that, actually, right? I don't think, right? We might have something better or something worse, but like the final utopian dialectical like synthesis is not coming, basically, right? It's kind of, almost Christian of you to continue thinking and hoping in that particular way.
Well, I was hoping.
Not you in particular, anybody, in one, right? One. And so I kind of liked the idea of like not looking for resolution, not pretending to provide resolution, and just like revealing, like she's, it's about sort of revealing that you can look at the same thing and from different perspectives and see a different thing, right? Stand over here, you see that, stand over there, and that person's shoes, see that. And then I kind of also thought it was, at least in some ways, somewhat analogous to collage, like the logics implicit in collage, which of course has been around for a big chunk of the 20th century and predates punk per se, punk qua punk or whatever, in terms of its aesthetic kind of development. But like, the inherent idea that drastic juxtapositions are somehow useful, and that they present a different kind of perspective precisely through their contrast, right? Not through the promise of some sort of, nice relationship between the things, right? In a collage. And it's not an accident that collage that are jarring and drastic and very contrastive and juxtapositional, like became part of a central part of the kind of punk aesthetic, right? It made sense.
Right. Well,
sense.
My hope was that now I know the correct pronunciation in Aymara, which is Cheche, not Chixi. My hope was that it was some kind of decolonial gesture.
Yeah, well, she's extremely critical about decolonial theory. And I was gonna invite you and everyone to look at her text, because I thought it was like first of all, it's a super punk text, and it could be extremely useful into thinking about decolonial, or the ubiquitous of the term decolonial now, which in some instances is not, it became a brand, right? And that's exactly what she's saying here in this. I have the link, but I can also,
well, you could just talk about it, I guess, and then share.
I could also share the screen, or yeah, let's share the screen so I make justice to what she's writing. Is
Let's see.
Oh, I don't think I'm able to share it though. So okay, yeah, now I am.
Send it in the chat. You can. Okay.
Yeah. So it's an issue of Hemisférica, this journal of the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics, and the name of the issue is called Colonial Gesture. So she was invited, of course, to write. At the moment, I think she was also in New York. So what she says as a note for the present English translation is, as I was reviewing the translation of this piece for Hemisférica, I realized that my article would become part of an issue devoted to decolonial gesture. I want to state frankly that I do not agree with the term decolonial, nor with all the redundant literature that has stemmed from it, to the point that it has almost become a school of thought and theory with more followers in the South than in the North. For me, it is a rather infelicious Gallicism that hurts my ears. And since I mistrust all forms of branding, I have come to dislike the unintelligible, elitist, and utterly boring debate that it has provoked up to now. And then she goes on saying that when somebody asks me what alternative terms I would suggest, I frankly and impolitely said that along with many Bolivians, I prefer to speak about demolition instead of deconstruction, and anti-colonial instead of decolonial, because I think it's more coherent to try to connect with the direct language of subalterns rather than with the word games of highbrow afrancesado intellectuals. And then she goes like, gesture is a nice word though. I like it.
Yes, yes. You know what I'm thinking with regard to racism? It says you need to be an anti-racist, not just saying that you're not racist.
A de-racist. Instead of a de-racist, yeah.
Yes. So I think it may go along that line, right? Because she says you have to be an anti-colonial. It's not just a decolonial.
Yeah, and she's talking about kind of like concepts that emerge from the street rather than from Zoom or from the university, you know, like she's talking about...
she's also talking about Mignolo, no? Like
yeah, she's talking about Mignolo.
Yes.
One dude in particular, right, who's made a whole career at a super hoity-toity fucking private university, right? Like citing one or two people from the South and then whatever, like sort of moving on and becoming his own kind of little empire. Yeah. I mean, I think it sounds to me like that's very directed at him and everybody that kind of works in that primarily kind of academic sector. And, you know, we're guilty of that ourselves to a certain extent, for sure. But it seems like she's basically saying, like, if you can't show me that you have, like, you know, on the street kind of like cred practice to back this up, then the word is just a word. Like, it's just it's just a word, right? It's just a theory game, basically. So I don't know. That's how I read it. But.
Yeah. So theory has to be together with practice, with everyday life.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I would like to move now to Cholo Sarikas. And this is a very interesting piece that you wrote Olga about the Peruvian hardcore scene. And because I was thinking at the beginning, you know, as a female, I could argue that punk aesthetics, at least, are colonizing and patriarchal. And sometimes I have trouble finding the emancipatory or polysemic possibilities in it, given my experience with Peruvian punk. And I think your chapter will corroborate this. So could you tell us a little bit?
My chapter and all the fought we got into, all the fight we got into Facebook, thanks to it.
Yes, of course.
Well, yeah. Again, it's like if you think about other punk's aesthetics, like we're probably gonna have time to talk about Las Chaps, but they are like aging punk women from Mexico City, and their punk aesthetic is totally liberating because they cover everything thematically, and they keep being punks, and they are women in their like 50s, 60s, and they are extremely combative. And Shane, if we have time, he'll probably tell you the anecdote we have there with them. Well, the chapter is about sadistic cholas, sex and violence in Peruvian literature, and I wrote it kind of liking the punk literature. Like, despite all of its shortcomings, I think that punks amongst Peruvian writers were the most radical ones. Isn't that sad?
Yes.
So, you know, like they took chances because they were not professional writers. You know Julio Duran, Martin Ruiz Roldan, who are more part of like the Cholo subte, a scene of punks. And then there is Buko, who's also like a super nice guy, but you know, he's writing for a hardcore, whiter, pituco Peruvian scene. And what I'm saying basically in that chapter is that the punk, because of punk's aesthetics, they are the only capable of representing cholas or racialized women as people that can enact violence through a political agenda or through sexual desire. That's the idea, that these sadistic cholas are basically Peruvian women that are racialized. And in the first half of the chapter, I work on this kind of seduction that punk had because of its anti-systemic critique with Sendero's Shining Path Marxist critique, right? So Shane's book talks about that, right? Like the connection and overlaps of certain punk's discourses and people that connect with Sendero's ideology. So what happens in these novels, in these two particular novels, is that this happens through seduction. And the sadistic cholas there are the women involved in Shining Path, and the punks are just the punks, right?
They just find them really sexy.
And what happens in the second part of that chapter is that, Torres Rotondo, Buko, he dares to elaborate more on what was before just a gold digger chola, right? Like Vargas Llosa literature, all the previous white urban literature described this type of the gold digging chola that would seek white lovers to be able to marry and procreate mestizos, right? This kind of a colonial narrative too. So what Buko does is that he gives these cholas a character, like a force in bed. So they enact sadism. There's they have sadistic sexual practices where they beat up the pituco, the white pitucos, in like a sort of staging a certain kind of vengeance, and not seeking social status and not seeking money, just seeking sex. So and violent sex. So that's what I'm trying to do there in that chapter.
So is this a study of femininity or is it a study of masculinity then?
It's a study of both, I guess. I mean, you cannot see one without the other. And the book spans on, non-conforming forms of sexuality that also explore ideas of chola, that also work with the chola, like Giuseppe Campuzano performing art. But that's part of like my book project, where yes, like this chola, I'm trying to elaborate this chola as a symbolic space of production of bodies and knowledge that is different from the exterior demands on the chola bodies.
Now, I would like to bring this cholas to the current state now. And in Peru, there during the lockdown, there have been a lot of cases of violence against women, against girls. So this is a very violent society against our gender. And so when you talk about the cholas, you also see, it's not a redemptive, but you see them as that they could be a force of change, not only what the punks say they are.
Yeah.
So how would you see them in the current environment in Peru with the violence? Because for the punks, they think of cholas and they think of violence, but now the violence is being practiced.
Yeah. I mean, yes, feminicide is a problem. Domestic violence has been a problem in Peru. It's more visible now, right? But it has happened. It has existed. It has predated our moment, and certainly the war too. War against Shining Path and MRTA. But what I'm doing is thinking about chola in terms of this figurative space capable of producing something other than violence, right? I mean, and producing violence at the same time. Like if we think about racialization in Peru, because this violence is concentrated in racialized women, right? Because we are the majority too. That's the Peruvian, right? Women and Peruvians in general are racialized people, are people that have been racialized. So, I mean, indigenous people were the first ones to be racialized in the context of the New World. And, the first defined as heresy, right? Like as heretics. And then mala raza, like the bad race, right? Indigenous people were the bad race. The Indians, the mestizos too. So what happens there is that the chola was always this like the urban, more deviant counterpart of the India, who was like fixed in space as a rural country woman, right? The chola would always be urban, for example. And cholas, the term itself, the etymology of the term refers to female dog or bitch, right? That's the chola, because the cholo is the male dog. So the chola always carried this animalistic, less than human nature, right? So when I was growing up in Peru, which is like, it's partly, I mean, the whole thing is like a projection of my own process of racialization and growing up in Peru during the war, and So when I was growing up, nobody wanted to be a chola, right? It was an insult. But now and in the present, there are many women, many collectives that appropriate the term and resignify the term, just as it happens with queer or with punk itself, right? That was an insult, and then it became a form of enacting one's own power, one's own agency. So what I'm looking into is like how what I'm arguing in my book is that this was only possible through violence. And I mean, the provocation of the book is that this violence was only possible through shining path combatants. Like when we saw that these women were capable of being soldiers, there was like a big societal awakening. Like we were never used to seeing cholas fighting for something or yelling at someone. So that's my hypothesis, and that's what I'm writing right now.
Militant cholas.
Yeah.
I mean, and now the chola peruana is different to the chola mexicana, right? Am I wrong?
Yeah. And it's different from the chola boliviana and the chola ecuatoriana. Silvia has work on vircholas and virlochas. But yeah, we're talking about the specific case of Peru, where race has been erased from our vocabulary, not only in terms of a society, but also in academia, right? Race has been erased from the study because we criticize race as a biology, but we still used it. We still were extremely racist, and we use cultural terms to refer to racism and to refer to race, right?
So talking about appropriations. So what we see now is that some populist ideologies have appropriated and distorted some of the punk anti-establishment discourses, right? And the logics related to do-it-yourself. We have emprendedores now, so everything, you are responsible of your future, you have to make it, right? And they have become part of what neoliberalism promotes. So from your point of view, how then punk can be a relational category, how it is situated with this contemporary neoliberal global condition? Is it another is it taking some neoliberal response to neoliberalism? Is it part of neoliberalism with this extreme individualism? What can you tell us?
You want me to say something? She just spoke a lot. I mean, yes and no. Like, obviously, if the assumption is that neoliberalism is the dominant game in town, like, how is it going to be separate from it, right? Completely separate from it. There's nothing that's literally, or very few things that are very, completely separate from it. But I don't know. I mean, when people pose that question, I personally, get tired of sort of, mentioning the word neoliberalism every sentence, but it's just fucking capitalism, right? It's just doing what it does. I would say that, like, in trying to kind of critically take apart what is sort of the series of assumptions that go into DIY, do it yourself, you have to, like, do the basic thing of asking what the it is and who the you is, right? And in service of what? Like, I've never thought that DIY, me personally at least, has any inherent politics to it. It's who it is and what they're doing with it, right? And to put that, like, in a little bit more concrete way, yes, it can be part of, like, I don't know, the expansion of, like, selfie culture. Everybody has a cell phone and can become their own kind of little aesthetic self-production machine on all the millions of platforms, right? And that's like a really good example of how, like, you know, we're just capitalism at work, making everybody feel special, right? And sort of, you know, present their kind of individual self to the world. It can also, DIY can also mean, and I think at various points in punk scenes and punk spaces, it has meant a collective project rather than an individual project, right? At least in a more kind of optimistic reading, like the production of a DIY venue, right? When there was nowhere to play, right? And it had required—
You're being hopeful. You're being hopeful.
Yes. I mean, that's the hopeful side, right? Or literally putting out your own disc with the 5 people that are in your band, like that's a collective project, right? Or a zine, or a zine that's connected to a scene. Like you scale up, right, and sort of see that there's a kind of collective world, however small or microcosmic it might be, that's part of that. But I you know, obviously it can be spun. It's just like saying, you know, there's the good kind of anarchism and the bad kind. There's the like highly libertarian kind of, it's all about me. You know, sort of, I remember sort of asking punks in Lima, like, what does, you know, DIY mean to you? Or what does anarchism mean to you? Like, do whatever you want. Do whatever you want. Like, if do whatever you want is your answer to that question, then you're probably on the neoliberal side of things, right?
That's right.
Like, do whatever you want in close and interesting and like critically oriented, consensus building, you know, collective project with these other people, is your answer, then it's a different kind of DIY, right? So I just never thought that like DIY had some sort of inherent politics built into it. It's like what the it is and who the you is and how many yous there are, and in the service of what, right? In that sense, I mean, there's a difference between me and my band putting out an album because we want to and playing at local venues where nobody earns a fucking dollar. And like people are volunteering to like keep the space going. I'm like thinking of recent memory, versus like the lonely fucking white dudes on 8chan, like sharing child porn, like, or producing the next horrible fucking racist meme, right? That's DIY too, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's just like, it's just who it is and in service of what at the end of the day. It feels like to me, right? But you know, on the good side of things, it promises a certain kind of de-alienation of just like sitting back and becoming a passive consumer and letting everything come to you, like via Netflix and via fucking Facebook and via whatever, name your contemporary manifestation of like capital production and distribution and consumption. Right?
Now, at the beginning of our conversation, we talk. You said something, Shane, about we'll talk about do it yourself, but mention something about some Mexicans, like an example.
Bueno, las chaps, no?
Yes.
Las chavas activas del punk.
So we had this, it's just a really iconic thing that we were sort of kind of had in the back of our minds, and then kind of just tried to actually put into practice in the production of the book, the process of bringing this book together, which has like 26 or 7 different contributors to it. We knew a couple of things. We didn't want it to be only academics, all right? And in fact, it's majority not academics. And some of the people who are even writing sort of academic style essays are not really academics. Like Rodrigo is not an academic. Agustina is not an academic, right? Even though they wrote kind of academic style essays. And there's a whole slew of people, they're the majority, in fact, who are not academics at all. But like, so it's been that from the beginning, but there was this really kind of symbolic moment when, like that was the plan from the beginning, in other words. We organized a conference at UNAM with our colleague Mararit Viera, who's sort of at UNAM and a couple of other places in Mexico City. And also IU, my university has like a gateway, an imperial gateway, physically located at UNAM. And anyway, we organized a conference there. And it was basically, you know, a chance to share drafts and like present to, you know, a Mexican kind of academic audience.
It's a seminar about youth cultures.
Yeah. It was,
so Meredith, who's been working in women punks in Tijuana and Mexico City, who worked with Maruja, I forgot, her last name. But
doesn't matter.
She's a Peruvian anthropologist who was the first one to work with the Chavas Activas del Punk, with the Chaps in the night. Maritza Urteaga. So Maritza Urteaga was there too, and they offer like a whole, like they frame our presentations within their seminario, the Juventudes, Seminar of Youth Cultures.
But the interesting thing was that, Maritza had a long-standing relationship to these women who go all the way back to like squats and like, certain bands, and, they're still active in certain kind of basically punk feminist, although they don't like the word feminist, it turns out.
Yeah,
it's in Maritza's piece. We can talk about that if you want. It's a tangent. But they're still active in this kind of punk, primarily punk women scene, and like, women in their 50s, and they showed up to our academic conference. There was a couple of them that kind of intervened at different moments, but this woman, Mago Rebelde, who is a member of, this kind of multitude of successive kind of punk collectives in Mexico City, she would just literally fucking grab the mic from people after they spoke, like, on the stage as the typical kind of formulaic, ritualized academics that we do, and like respecting everybody's turn and being all proper and whatever. And she would just grab the mic and just start going off. And sometimes it would be going off on us, like for sort of how kind of abstracted we were as academics at one level from, what we were talking about, which is of course true. And at other moments, sort of gesture towards the need to like have a conversation, like a conversation with her and other people who have sort of dedicated their lives essentially to this. And the long story short is that like at the very end of the conference, she became like the figure of the conference. Like she literally became the kind of, uninvited spokesperson, but like just became this kind of character that kind of took over the conference. And she had amazing things to say. And at the very end, she just stood up and read this manifesto that she had written in 2017. And our response to that as editors was not to freak out, but like, hey, can we put that in the book? Like, that was fucking cool. That was super interesting. And it really is. I mean, we sent you a copy. So
it's an amazing manifesto.
Yeah. And it's like amazing how incredibly global it is. I mean, it's very Mexican at multiple points. And like, that's why we have like, a page of footnotes trying to explain to people all the references that she's making in terms of like, recent and quite old Mexican history, but it's very global in its scope. And we just thought like, that's what we were sort of setting out to do in the first place. And, although we didn't know her, at least, Olga and Rodrigo and I didn't know her, Meredith knew her, and people down there obviously did. That was kind of like the symbolic moment of like, this is what we're here to do. Like we're sort of trying to create these conversations rather than freak out and run away because an uninvited speaker like kind of became the de facto dominant speaker in this context, right? So anyway, she's like the conclusion. Her manifesto is the conclusion in lieu of conclusion in the book.
I think this is a very interesting way to kind of start closing our conversation, because at the beginning we talk about the aesthetics of punk and their interventions were aesthetically, and there is a spectrum, right? An heterogeneity of ways to do it. Yeah. But it seems to me, and this is my bias, that the feminists, although they don't want to be called feminist, are the most political ones.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, certainly what I would say what happens with feminists and in the book is that they are the ones that sustain their actions through time. Like if you think about Mago Rebelde and her band Virginidad Sacudida, Shaken Virginity, they are certainly provoking these moments, right? And like standing against the very macho, extremely macho Mexican culture that also, the Virgen de Guadalupe whole thing. And like they are the ones screaming that they don't want to be virgins. they don't want to be virgins. You can certainly think, and they told us later that they had various moments of provocations. The punks, their male companions, were violent against her. The police, of course, was violent against them. And the only way that they had to survive was by being together as punk women and by sustaining their actions through time. So that's definitely one of the most radical, punk aesthetic and punk activism that you can encounter in the book, and it's them. It's not gonna come from the Peruvian punks.
No, it's not.
But yeah,
it is.
and they are still active. And in Meredith's piece, they still they convene together, and they have all these conversations and conflicts with younger Mexican punks that do want to use feminism as a tool, because like in the 80s when they were growing up, when the chaps were growing up, feminism, just as in Peru, was a way of exerting more violence against women. And of course nobody wanted to be a feminist either in Peru in the 80s or in Mexico in the 80s, right? But they are able to have that conversation with younger women in Mexico. So that's Meredith's piece is a great moment of intergenerational punk feminist discourses and action and political action.
And a lot of it is about whether or not to actually take on the label feminist or not.
Yeah.
Like what it implies for any given woman, depending on generation and age and like different experiences.
And in the present of feminist side too.
And
right?
I really have to read that chapter.
I mean, it's kind of resonant of the stuff that you wrote about sort of, women in Peru who just have this kind of hesitance to like, what they're doing looks like feminism to everybody around them.
Yeah.
Like for some reason, they don't want to like take on that label, right? Because it's associated with whatever, like some sort of, I don't know, like anti-man
with frigid lesbians. That's how the Peruvian left portrayed feminists.
Or maybe class dimensions.
That's true. That was
class dimensions of like white kind of elite feminists.
Yeah.
Who they're not really hanging out with or that kind of thing, right? So anyway.
Yeah. Well, this is really, really fascinating, and I think we ran out of time.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if you would like. If you will have anything else to add, or to say something about the book, or.
No, just thanking you again.
Thanks for the opportunity.
For the opportunity of sharing.
We wish Rodrigo could have been here, but he's been a little sick. So he kind of decided to opt out. He's the third editor on the book. And there's.
When is the book gonna be out?
About a year. About a year. We're literally sending off our final bit, and then it goes into design and production probably in the next couple of months. But academia is not punk in that sense. It's very slow. It's very slow. So yeah, probably August, September of next year probably. So
excellent. Well, let me just check if there are any questions from the audience or any trolls. I don't think there is much.
4chaners.
No, fortunately, the trolls, maybe they don't speak English. That's why they couldn't come.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, Olga and Shane, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Social Justice Institute for taking the time to talk with us today. And I hope we will be able to meet again.
Yes.
And hopefully it will be in less dystopic times.
Hopefully.
So thank you. And to our audience, the third dialogue of the series, Struggles in Places, Contagious Traditions of Resistance and Solidarity, will be on October 8th. We will post details on the Facebook page of the Graduate Students Association of the Social Justice Institute. So stay tuned. Well, thank you again, and cheers.
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 Salud.
Salud, salud.
Salud, Peru.
Salud, salud.
Yeah, okay.
Chixi Punks.
Yeah, yeah.
Chao,
Thank you.
gracias.
Ciao.
Okay, chao. Muchas gracias.
Later.
Bye.